Hello and welcome to Worklog. I'm Sean Hickman, and I'm an indie iOS developer who works on an app called Sofa, which helps you to be more intentional with your downtime. And if you're new to this, Worklog is a podcast where I kind of share my journey of building Sofa into a successful indie app business. You know, I cover like things I've learned, challenges, insights, all that kind of stuff. And in this episode, I'm going to talk about actually the Worklog podcast because it is new. So I'm kind of explain some of my thinking behind why I'm even doing that. I'm going to share a little bit about what I've been working on, specifically around the podcast player that's coming to Sofa. And then the main topic for today is really what I'm calling launch mode. And it's essentially like I'm going to talk about how I transition in from, you know, when I'm developing something new, like the podcast player, like when do I transition into I'm making this thing into I need to like ship this thing. And so launch mode is the working title for that. But I'm going to talk about how I transition into that and the types of things that I do during launch mode. Yeah. But anyway, so it's been a weird start to the year. I mean, it's March already, but I've been sick twice, like significantly. Like, I don't know if I had the flu, but I had flu-like symptoms twice and basically lost like 2 weeks of work. And in the past, it was like early February, I got it again. I'm pretty sure that my nephew coughed on my dinner plate. Pretty sure. I like kind of saw it out of the corner of my eye, and then a couple days later, I was sick with like fever, body aches, the works, all that stuff. So thank you for that. But anyway, that's like, especially like I'm like really approaching the end of development for this initial podcast player, like the initial features, and like losing a week of work. I was just like, oh, so I was frustrated. But after that, I like kind of hustled and kind of wrapped up kind of the last few remaining like large parts of the podcast player that are going to be there. But I'll talk about that in a little bit. Another thing going on is like, so if you're watching this on YouTube, I'm using the Osmo Pocket 3 for this to record the video. And I've used a bunch of different cameras over the years, like some more, quote unquote professional, some more, casual consumer, whatever. And what I want something that's like very little fuss. I just basically want to turn the thing on and use it. And when it comes to photography, the thing that I've kind of leaned into is using the Leica Q2. And like, I definitely have like issues with basically every camera that I've used, but the Leica Q2 is, I just love it. I love it so much. But one of the main reasons is there's just no fuss, right? You just grab the camera. You don't have to worry about what lens you're going to bring, and you just take pictures. Like you're just more like in the moment. And when it came to doing YouTube videos and all that stuff, when I was using like more professional stuff before, like I was very concerned about the video quality like all the time, so I would set up lights, I would try and color grade stuff, and I'm trying to embrace more of like a less fussy approach so that I'm able to actually do this more frequently because, when I'm trying to work on the app and do a video, like that's actually kind of hard to make that transition. So I'm trying to make this like pretty easy to do. And the Osmo Pocket 3 is like, yeah, it's great. Like the idea of like, there's no fuss. You just flip the thing on and you start recording. I love that. But I'm having like some like issues with this thing. And one of them is, it just like won't keep focus unless, like, the only way I can guarantee focus is to do this face tracking feature that it has. So if you're watching this, like, you know, it's following me around, which I actually don't like. I like, for what I'm doing, like talking head stuff like this, like I don't want that feature turned on. But when I turn it off, I've recorded stuff where like I'm just not focused, and I don't understand. I don't know if it's like something wrong, with my actual, like, is there something wrong with the actual device? Is it a software problem? Whatever. But the fact that I just like question this every time I record, I'm like, am I in focus? That's really, really annoying. And that kind of takes away from the, hey, it's not fussy, I don't need to worry about it kind of approach. Like, I do worry about it all the time. So I don't know what I'm going to do. But for now, to use this thing, I keep the face tracking thing on, and it's fine. I find it a little distracting personally. But you know, what are you going to do? The other issue I'm having is like, it'll basically like brick itself. So there was a couple times recently where I turn it on and it just, the DJI logo is just on and it just doesn't go away. I have rebooted the thing. I've switched SD cards. I have done a factory reset, and then it eventually just comes back. Like, I'm updated to the latest software, all that stuff. So that's the other thing too, where like, there's been moments where I'm ready to record something, I turn it on, and then it's just not recording. So this whole, like, I still want the, like, I don't want something that's very fussy, but I also need something that's very reliable and that just works when I need it to work. So I don't know. Long term, I don't know about this Pocket 3. Maybe they'll fix something at some point. Maybe there's a Pocket 4 that's better. I don't know. Maybe I go back to like some Sony camera. I don't know. Something I can rely on. But anyway, it's just, is that enough for the small talk? Are we done with that? Let's get into the Worklog podcast stuff. So I started, you know, I've been doing this YouTube channel for a couple of years, technically since like 2015. And, you know, there's been periods where like I do more videos, fewer videos. And then, but really the main purpose of this channel has been to essentially just like kind of document my progress building Sofa, working on Sofa, all that kind of stuff. And I think like traditionally, like developers would do a blog and do this stuff, but I like video and I like YouTube, and I think it's really fun. The other thing too is that I think that YouTube just has more reach than like a blog would. Nothing against blogs. Like, I read blogs every day, but I do think YouTube, there's just something special about it. And I personally just love YouTube and video and all that stuff. But there's also times when people just want to listen to something and they don't necessarily want to watch something. And there's actually some podcasts that I listen to on YouTube, but I'm not really watching them. So like, I'll put the video on, but then like, it's like playing in the background and I'm just kind of listening to it. So the video isn't really that big of a deal. But that's where they kind of publish stuff. So, you know, so that's where I go. But, I have thought about this for a while. Like, I would like to do a podcast for a bunch of reasons, but I'm like, well, what's the podcast about? How is it different from YouTube and all that kind of stuff? And when I really looked at like the videos that I make, they're basically podcasts, and like essentially the format of them. They're not like super visual things where if you're missing, like if you're listening to this right now, you're not really missing anything. Like you're not seeing my gigantic forehead and the office that I'm in and stuff like that. But like it's the audio stuff is, I think will translate well to podcasts, because it's not like I'm doing all these crazy effects video wise and all this B-roll and all that stuff. It's literally just, a talking head. Like I'm just kind of pressing record and talking to the camera. So I do think that it translates to podcasts pretty well. The other thing is, like, there's just people who, like I think of Stratechery, so from Ben Thompson. So I do subscribe to that, and it started out as like it is a newsletter still, like a written newsletter, but I think it was a few years ago he started to, along with the newsletter, he would release a podcast version where he reads the article, and that was amazing because most of the time I like wouldn't read the article, but I always listened to the podcast, and that was just like my preferred like way to enjoy that type of content. And since that, I was like thinking about this for myself, and I just like never did it, but I'm like, there's probably people who would prefer to not watch me on YouTube or subscribe on YouTube for whatever reason, but they would listen to a podcast, no problem. So I wanted to figure that out at some point. And then since I'm working on a podcast player right now, and I'm kind of building this functionality into Sofa, I wanted to kind of dive into that and to learn a little bit about like the production end of a podcast and the creator side of it. Like what's involved, how do you do all this stuff? It's one thing for me to like read an XML feed or an RSS feed and kind of get the data and put it together as a podcast player. But it's another thing for me to also understand the production side of it. And so this is my way of essentially like learning how to do that and what's involved and how does this stuff work and whatever. And since I've learned a good bit about, how to make a YouTube video, just technically, cameras, audio, editing, all the publishing, all that kind of stuff, the jump to podcast hasn't been too crazy, but podcasts are definitely more complicated for sure. Especially because like with YouTube, there's, if you're going to like push a video out, long form video, I mean, it's YouTube. Like there's nowhere else to put it. I mean, you could put it other places, but like, are you going to do that? So, but with podcasts, it's much more distributed, which has pros and cons. And as a nerd, I love the pros of that, right? Like there's more control, for myself. But you have to figure out like where are you going to host this podcast, and how do you get the podcast and all the different, like essentially like distributors, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, that kind of stuff. And, it was definitely a little bit of a learning curve to figure that stuff out. But that's the point of me doing all this, is to learn those little things. But yeah, so anyway, so that's like some of the background into the Worklog podcast. And I was thinking about like, I'm like, okay, I'm going to turn my YouTube content into podcast, essentially like repurpose the same content. So I do this once and I'll push it out in different ways. But I was like, what do I call this thing? Because on YouTube, I don't think it's weird to have a channel like named after me or named after a person. You go like, follow someone that way. But a podcast, I was like, is it just called The Sean Hickman Show? That seems a little weird. It's just called Sean Hickman. Like, what is it? And I keep like when I'm doing my development work, design work, especially with like larger features, I keep a work log, and it's essentially just like a daily little journal for what I'm working on. Sometimes I'm just like chucking random thoughts in there. Sometimes it's I'm thinking through something. So I'm like, how is this going to work? There's different options, all that kind of. So it's like my own personal diary or journal and document for thinking through what I'm doing in the moment. And I thought like, oh, that's kind of a cool name for essentially what I'm doing on YouTube, and what the podcast would be is like, I am essentially sharing my thinking, my process, my approach, my work, all that kind of stuff. So what if I just call it Worklog? So I actually kind of like the name. I think it's kind of nice. But that's essentially where it came from. Like I keep a document like this myself, and as I'm working, and I actually find it really helpful, because there's times where I'll be like, oh, last week I was working on something, and now it like kind of came up again. So I'll actually go back and like look at the notes that I wrote. Sometimes I'm just like posting screenshots or links or whatever. Like it's just like a dumping ground. It doesn't have to be pretty or anything. And that's kind of like what I think, what I think my like YouTube stuff has evolved to, and maybe the podcast will be interesting. I don't know. We'll see. But there will be a lot of overlap between like the podcast and the YouTube channel, but there will be videos that I do on YouTube that don't make sense to put on the Worklog podcast. I think like anytime I do like any kind of photography focused video that won't be on the podcast here. So if you're someone who's like, oh, should I subscribe to the podcast or the YouTube channel or whatever? The podcast is going to be a more focused version of the YouTube channel, where I'm mostly talking about Sofa, development, design, basically like stuff I've learned about, or I'm in the process of learning about, like building and kind of running this business. So, and if you don't care to get anything else other than that, like you don't care about when I post videos on cameras or Disney or whatever, then the Worklog podcast is going to be maybe for you. And you can still just follow it on YouTube too, because anything I post on this podcast will also be on YouTube. So if you want to just get it all, just go to YouTube. That's fine. So, but yeah, so I'm excited for the podcast. And I think one of the reasons I didn't do it before, because I've been thinking about it for like a couple of years, is I was so I work for myself. It's just me. So I have to be very careful with how I spend my time. Like, okay, if I spend my time on this thing, that means I can't do these other 5 things. And the main thing that I have to focus on all the time, like the dominant thing I have to focus on, is Sofa and like that product, that business, and figuring that stuff out. So if there's ever conflicts where like, yeah, I could do a video today, but I actually really need to get through this work for Sofa, like Sofa's going to win all the time. So I do want to eventually get to like a really consistent publishing schedule for YouTube and the podcast, but I'm still figuring that stuff out. And it is harder, especially like the past couple of weeks where I'm getting closer to launching this big feature. So there's these time periods where like I'm like very heads down and like very focused on finishing work. So pulling myself out of that for an hour or 2 hours to like record something, edit it, and get it published, I'm just like, it's not worth it. Like I'll do this in a couple weeks. So that's essentially what happens. But I think I can publish frequently enough that over time, even if it's not like every single week or something, it'll still be frequently enough. So it's all good. Like it won't be months between things. It may be weeks between when I publish something, but not months, ideally. But yeah, so I think I've got a workflow down where the podcast stuff shouldn't add too much extra work to publishing something. Because again, I'm doing, when I'm recording this now, this same thing will go on the podcast and YouTube. And the only extra stuff I have to do is like uploading this to the podcast vendor and kind of putting that stuff out and adjusting show notes and stuff like that. But overall, it doesn't increase the production side too much. Whereas before I was like really concerned that it was gonna make my production stuff like grow quite aggressively. So I didn't do it, but now I am. So there you go. So that's it on the Worklog podcast stuff. If anyone has any questions about it, feel free to, write a comment if you're here on YouTube, or shoot me a message on social media or email, whatever. I'm happy to answer. And if you think someone would be interested in the podcast, please share it. That'd be awesome. And like wherever you listen to podcasts, wherever, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever, it's all there. So you can just search Worklog and it should show up. And I'll have links and everything in the description. So don't worry about that. Okay, so let's talk about some of the stuff I've been working on over the past couple weeks that have taken up a significant amount of time. So if you haven't been following, for my app Sofa, I am building in a podcast player into my app. And it, as I've been working on this, it definitely feels like I'm like building another app into the app. And I say this from like a technical perspective, like the amount of new stuff I've had to add code wise to the app is like pretty significant, to get all this stuff working. But with all that said, the idea is that while it's technically feels like I'm adding another app to this, the experience of it, the design of it, I am shooting for, it doesn't. Like it should just feel very natural, and it should feel like, even if you if you don't want to listen to podcasts in Sofa, this feature basically doesn't exist for you. Like it's invisible. It doesn't feel in your face or anything like that. But if you do want to listen to podcasts in Sofa, it should fit in very naturally to the experience that you're already used to, and doesn't get in the way of how you use Sofa, whether it's for video games or movies, TV shows, whatever. So that's been just, a lot of work and a lot of fun, to be honest, like to figure that out. But I'm very excited for it. And honestly, since like the fall-ish, maybe like November-ish, Sofa has been my primary podcast player. And I listen to a lot of podcasts. I've used so many different apps over the years, and I obviously have thoughts on those apps, good and bad. But Sofa has been my primary podcast player for the past couple of months, and honestly, like I love it. And obviously I'm biased, right? I made it, so that makes sense. But when I think about some of the other options out there, I haven't felt any like itch or desire to go back. And for me, I think I'm like, okay, I think this is going to work, because I've used more like, I've used Overcast, Castro, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Cast, probably other ones that I can't remember. So like I've used ones that are beyond your kind of basic Apple Podcasts and Spotify and stuff like that. And I just I'm just really liking how this is all working in Sofa. So I'm going to do a video before, probably closer to launch, where I kind of go over everything and show how it works. Basically like a little demo video, so you'll get all that. I did do a demo-ish video like a couple months ago. So if you want to go watch that, you can do it. But it's getting there. It is getting there. But recently, so I've been working on, the first thing is CarPlay support. And this has been easier in some ways than I expected and harder in other ways. But if you have a car that has CarPlay support, I can't speak for other people. I can just speak for me. So, the first time I got a car that had CarPlay, I was just like, oh my God, this is friggin' amazing. Like, absolutely love it. And I could go back if I had to, but like, I don't want to. CarPlay is amazing. Especially for listening to podcasts or music, and then the GPS it's so good. And I knew that I wanted to get CarPlay support for Sofa, but I didn't know. I was like, maybe this will be in the initial release. Maybe it won't. We'll see. Because you do have to apply for like a special entitlement from Apple to do it. And so I applied for that a couple weeks ago, and I was like, this might take a little while, but it came in pretty quick. So I got all that. And then, it's one thing like for in developing for iOS, all this stuff works differently, like behind the scenes. So widgets, shortcuts, app intents, CarPlay, like all these things work differently. And like how you share data from like the main app to those little extensions, essentially, it all works differently. So with CarPlay, I was like, I don't know how this is going to go, but it integrates with the main app very, very easily, which was great. And honestly, most of the work that I had to do for CarPlay support was like kind of reconfiguring some of my like shared code with how I'm playing a podcast, how I'm accessing the data and stuff like that. And it was more rethinking that a little bit to be more shareable across CarPlay and the main app. And I would say right now, like 90% of that stuff is like ironed out. There's still some little bugs and stuff to fix, but it's awesome. And the development tools are actually pretty good for CarPlay. I do wish that there was like an actual CarPlay like simulator that I could like build and run to, but it has to work off of the main app. Cause like I was having this issue where if I did like a cold launch of the CarPlay app without the main app already running, I was getting these crashes. And it's just hard to debug that stuff unless the main app is already running with the simulator. So, it's a little goofy, but I've got most of that stuff figured out. But yeah, the CarPlay support, and it's great. Like, I remember like when I was first doing, awesome, cat hair. Gang, there's cat hair everywhere in this place. Like these cats, I love them. I will die for them. But the friggin' amount of cat hair, it's everywhere. Oh my God. Anyway, CarPlay. What the heck was I talking about? Yes. So CarPlay, when I first used it in my car and like was listening to a podcast, I was like, like there's just something like it's like so satisfying when you have an idea in your head and then you go make it. And then the first time you use it and it like works, it's like, holy crap. Like this is awesome. And excuse me. This is what happened. Like when I first got podcasts working on my phone, and I was like, the first time I was like doing the dishes and making dinner, and I was just listening to podcasts like I do all the time. But I was doing it in Sofa, and I was like, oh man, this is awesome. Like this is so good. So it's just very exciting and satisfying to see it. So the CarPlay stuff I'm excited for. And even if I didn't have a CarPlay app, Apple has like a thing called the Now Playing API. So anytime like audio is playing, you're essentially like tapping into that, and it's just kind of like this system level thing. So anytime you see, like if you're playing something on your phone and you lock your phone, but then there's like a little player, when you see the phone again, it's like play, pause, all that kind of stuff. That's like the system shareable Now Playing, API and all that kind of stuff. And that actually does work with CarPlay. So there is like a Now Playing app in CarPlay. So even if I didn't have a CarPlay app, you could still technically like listen and like control the actively playing podcast, but you couldn't like choose which one to listen to and look at your list and stuff like that. But anyway, CarPlay's working. It's good. And it's actually a very simple approach. There's 2 tabs. And again, I'll do like a demo in the future with this stuff. But there's 2 tabs. There's the Up Next tab, which just shows kind of the global Up Next list of, episodes to listen to. You just pick one and start listening. And then there's a List tab, and essentially any list that you have in Sofa that has like an active podcast in it that you're like actively following new episodes for, it'll show that list. And then if it's essentially like a very easy way to make playlists. So if you want to like separate out your podcast into like sports, news, tech, whatever you want to do. So if you just feel like listening to news, like you can just go to that list and then just start listening to stuff, and it'll go from there. And that works in the app and then in CarPlay too, which is nice. So, but again, like I feel like other apps I've used, creating different playlists and different stuff was just like, I would say like overly complicated. And I really like the way this works very naturally with how lists are already created in Sofa. So, the other thing I did was widgets. So I added some new widgets for the Up Next stuff. And I should say Up Next is like the feature essentially. So whenever you have new episodes to listen to for podcasts, there's this Up Next list that is automatically created for you, and then you tap on that and it shows a list of the episodes, and then you pick and choose what you want to listen to. And I made some widgets for that. So there's lock screen widgets, and then different sizes for your home screen. And I think they look pretty good. I'm not like a huge widgets person. There are a couple widgets that I do love. So on my phone, I have a photos widget, which just kind of like rotates with new photos, which I love photography, so that makes sense. I have the weather widget, and then I have the calendar widget. And honestly, that's like the first screen of my phone. That's just kind of the glanceable stuff. But I don't really use any other widgets. Like I have Sofa widgets on my phone, but that's literally just a test. So I'm not a huge widgets person, but I do know that, there's people who just love widgets, which is totally fine. So I have a couple for the Up Next stuff. And what's cool with the Up Next widgets is by default, it'll show you like kind of the global Up Next stuff. But if you want to choose to show the Up Next list just for a specific list, like I was just talking about, like just show me news, right? Or tech or sports. You can configure that and choose to just show a certain list. And then if you tap on one of the items from the widget, it'll open the app and start playing that specific episode. So all that stuff's working, which is great. Widgets, I find from a development experience, I think I actively dislike working on widgets. I don't like it. Creating the view, like creating the UI with Swift UI that's fun. That's fine. Everything else around widgets, between sharing data with, you have to like share data with an app group. If you're not familiar with this stuff, you don't have like direct access to, the database unless I would do some like heavy refactoring. And then like updating widgets is, it's just like, I think it's gotten more reliable, but there's just sometimes like, it just like the widget just like won't update. And there's this whole like timeline mechanism, and Apple will prioritize that or deprioritize that from what I understand, depending on what other parts of the OS need resources. And if you try and update it too frequently, it won't update all the time. So from a developer experience, I dislike widgets. I don't enjoy working on them. And excuse me, it's something where every time I have to do widget stuff, I'm just like, it feels like a chore. I'm just like, oh God, here we go. But they're popular enough where, it is worth doing. And I could probably do more widgets and stuff like that. But like, so for example, you can do interactive widgets now. And one of the things I was trying to get working was like a playable button. So like a play button with next to each item in the widget. So you could play, pause just from the widget itself. And like, I got it like 80% working, and then there was just 20% that just like wasn't reliable. and I'm like, is this not reliable because I'm like in this development environment? Like what the hell's going on, kind of thing. So I just decided, I'm like, all right, I'm not for now, I'm not doing interactive widgets because I can't get it to reliably work. So the widgets that are there will have to be good enough for now. So if you're a widgets person who like really loves widgets, like Sofa has a lot of widgets for lists and now for the up next stuff. So, you have tons of access to it, but just know that at least for me, working on widgets is it's not pleasant. But okay, now transitioning, the next thing I did was I did add a few shortcuts to the app. Shortcuts, especially with the new like app intent stuff, where it just kind of works in your code base. You have access to core data and everything. This is what I wish that widgets had. Shortcuts is much more pleasant to work on. Definitely a little more like I have to wrap my head around it every time. I feel like I have to like relearn it every time I dive into it, where I'm like, oh yeah, how's this work again? Okay, yeah. But so I just added two little shortcuts, one that will open your up next queue and then start playing just the next podcast, and then another one where you can choose a specific list and it'll start playing. So it's just like, it's basically like a fancy play button for either the main up next queue or for a specific list. And there's probably going to be more shortcut actions over time for this stuff, but for now that was like kind of the bare minimum. But that's there. And shortcuts are, like I said, they're much more pleasant to work on than widgets, at least for me and for how Sofa is configured. And then the last stuff is just like performance improvements with the audio player in Sofa and getting that working really well with CarPlay, and especially like getting the, there's all these like little edge cases once you start getting into it. You're like, okay, let's say that someone, they get in their car, they plug in their phone, they start controlling Sofa on CarPlay, all good, no problem. Now let's say that they have someone in the passenger seat with them, and that person is controlling CarPlay, but from the phone, not from, CarPlay. All that stuff needs to stay in sync. The UI has to do stuff that makes sense and not like get in the way. And also the amount of like memory, like it seems like CarPlay is more restrictive on memory usage and stuff like that. So there was some stuff I had to do to make sure that it's not using too much memory, that images aren't too big, all that kind of stuff. So just really focused on trying to get that stuff working reliably and consistently, and not causing huge memory spikes and stuff like that. So that's been what I've been working on. So it's been very, very busy couple weeks, but these last few things, so CarPlay, widgets, shortcuts, those are the last main features and parts of the podcast player feature that I've been working on for the past couple months. And that kind of transitions nicely into launch mode. So let's talk about launch mode. So, so basically, I think I guess we have to talk about deadlines a little bit too. The way that I prefer to work, and I did not have this luxury for most of my life because I worked for other people. I worked in consulting. So like you're just kind of given a deadline and then you have to fit your work around that deadline or within that deadline. But I've always found that to be a very unnatural way to work, especially for stuff like this where you're like, okay, I want to add a podcast player into Sofa. If I set a deadline on day one, what the hell date would I pick, right? Like, would I say 6 months? Would I say 5 months? 3 months? I don't know. Like, I've never done that before. So how would I know what date to pick? And this is what happens, like, in a lot of corporate scenarios and business scenarios, like, usually the deadline comes from higher up, either some executive or lead in the company. And that might be tied to quarterly earnings. It might be tied to some meeting that they have in the future. Who knows, right? But it's not tied to anything related to the product. It's usually something tied to marketing, finance, business reasons, whatever. So that's not how I prefer to work. So the way I prefer to do it is, and this is what I did for the podcast player is, okay, I'm going to work on this podcast player. I'm going to build this in Sofa. I don't fully know what this is yet. And I don't even know like the full scope of it yet. And I think that's another mistake that people and companies make is like, they try and scope everything out about this feature before they even start, which I think is like kind of nuts, because if you like, I said like, okay, I do want CarPlay support. And I guess this is all different because I just work for me. I'm just one person. But like, I think even in small team environments, this stuff makes sense, which is like, okay, we want CarPlay support. We want widgets. We want shortcuts. We want the ability to create playlists or whatever. That's all fine. But like, once you get into it, like you don't really know what's involved fully until you start working on it. Because all types of little goofy things pop up, little bugs you didn't know existed start getting in the way and stuff like that. So the way I prefer to do it is I will figure out like at the beginning, okay, I want to do a podcast player and I want to add it to Sofa. And I think through like, well, why do I want to do this? Like, what's the point of doing this? What do I think it makes sense? Why does it make sense? Are there other things I could be working on instead? And the answer is always yes. But I try and figure out like, is this worth it? Why is it worth it? All that kind of stuff. And then I start to iron out, okay, well, what do I think this thing is? And what do I think is going to be involved in this? And what do I think it might need at the very beginning? Right? Because I know that like, that's the beauty of software is like, it's never done. So I can improve things over time. But for this kind of first version, what do I think it needs? And I outline all that stuff. Like I think through it, I write it down, and CarPlay was there at the beginning, right? But I didn't really know, like, I'm not really going to know what's like fully involved until I start doing it. Like, yes, I read Apple's documentation on stuff and everything, but like until you start building, right, you don't really know. Unless you've done it before, then you know. So basically what I did is I outline that stuff and I just start working on it, right? I start figuring stuff out, start building stuff, and I try and get like the most basic version of it working right away, because I want to start using it like in real life as fast as possible, because like that's another feedback mechanism where, oh, okay, I thought it was going to be like this, but actually when I'm using it, I want it to work like this, or it makes more sense to do something else. And all that stuff is very fluid. And I do have, like, there's kind of like different stages. So like that's like the initial development stage. And I guess like almost like a prototyping stage for me, and to get that stuff working in like kind of a basic state. And then I do a public beta, and I always do a public beta. And, once I started shipping those out, yesterday I just pushed out beta 20. So I've done 20 beta releases for this feature. And this is like the next stage where, again, I have not set any deadlines yet. Like I haven't said, here's when I'm going to ship it. Here's what I'm going to do. But I get a basic version working for myself that is reliable, isn't going to like totally wreck someone's stuff, at least knowingly. And then I get other people using it, and then they're going to give feedback. They're going to share bugs, all that kind of stuff. And then constantly iterating on stuff, because, I am initially building it for me, but then once other people use it, I'm getting their feedback for how things should work, how they shouldn't work. And I factor all that stuff in. So, and that's just like the beta cycle, like constantly going through it. And in a way I do have like these mini deadlines, but I don't really treat them as deadlines, but like I'm kind of shipping stuff all the time through this period. I'm just shipping it to the beta group, and I'm getting feedback that whole time. But let's talk about launch mode now, because since I have yesterday in that beta 20 included CarPlay support, widgets, and shortcuts. And those are the last big chunks of things. And so now that those are out and people are going to start using them, the beta group's going to start using them, there's going to be bugs. They'll share that stuff. There's going to be feedback, all that. But now it's like, okay, the initial feature set is complete. And so from this point on, it's exclusively bug fixes and polishing. Like that's it. And so that's what I call launch mode for me, where I am no longer like adding new features to this thing. It is purely, everything is geared now towards launching this thing and getting it out to the public. That's the goal. And there's a lot involved with that, even outside of development. I have to do a lot of marketing stuff, update the website, write support documentation, all types of stuff. So this is like the next stretch of work is going to be fairly high for this launch. And internally, I have a launch date. I know what the launch date's going to be with like, I'm going to say like 90% certainty, but I don't share that date publicly until it's 100%, or at least like 99. So I know what the deadline is. And this is the time that I set deadlines for myself. Whenever it's launch mode, whenever I get into that period of launch mode, that to me is the time to set a deadline, because otherwise before then you're just kind of like, I don't know, trying to hit some arbitrary date that is not really based in reality, right? You're just kind of like fitting everything into that as much as you can. And anyone who's kind of worked in those environments can understand that like deadlines are very important. You have to have them. But I think when you introduce them matters more than people realize. And since I work for myself, I have that luxury, which is like the best. So I'm now in launch mode. And I think like an initial question that you may have, and this is a question that I kind of ask myself through this whole period, is like, okay, how do I know it's time to move into launch mode? Like to stop with new stuff and to just focus on launching. And it's hard to like pinpoint, but it's definitely more of like, this is where like the art and science of this stuff comes in, because it is a bit of a feeling where, you know, when I first listed out the main features, like what's going to be included in the podcast player, it's, you know, a list of like, oh, it's got to do this, this, and this, right? And as I get into stuff, I think like, this can wait, right? And I even have, I'm looking at like my list now, and I keep different like sections of stuff that I'm going to work on. So there's like stuff that's in progress, stuff that's up next, stuff I haven't started yet, or stuff I'm like waiting on, like feedback or see how it goes. But I also have a maybe list where it's like, you know, one of the things on here is control center widgets, right? So that was a maybe for a while, where I'm like, you know, I'm going to do widgets. Do I need to do control center widgets? Right. And that's something that it doesn't have to be there on day one. That can be like a follow-up release. Another thing that's here is like, people were asking for like very specific settings about, like when you tap on a podcast, should it play automatically or should it just open its details? And right now I have it set to it just plays automatically. It just starts playing and shows like the podcast player. And I've gotten beta feedback saying like, hey, I would like a setting about this. They may be right, but that's something where I'm like, you know, I think I need more. I think I need broader feedback on this outside of the beta group, and I don't have to have that setting day one. That's something that can come later. So there's all types of stuff that's in here in this like maybe list that I'm like, yeah, maybe it does make sense. Maybe it doesn't. This stuff can wait. And as it gets closer, as I start like adding these larger features, there's just like this feeling, this is like, gang, I did go to art school. Like I am a designer by trade, and I've learned development over time. So this might sound like a bunch of hippie crap to you, but like there's this feeling that hits me where I'm like, all right, I think this is ready, right? Not like there's still bugs to fix. There's still like polishing to do, all that stuff. But like feature wise, as like a complete thought, like for me to share this with someone and to explain it to them and to have them use it, that they would say, yeah, this feels like a good podcast player, and this makes sense, and I don't feel like I'm losing out by, say, switching from something else. Or maybe this is even better. But it is a feeling, and I'm not saying I always get it right, but it starts to creep in where I'm like, okay, I think I'm getting close. The major features that I listed out here, I'm done them. And yeah, I could keep adding stuff, but like I don't have to, right? Like that stuff can come later. It doesn't have to be there for the very first version of this. And that, I think that line would be different for every person. Like if someone else was working on Sofa and building this, like their line might be different, and that's fine. But basically I'm like, okay, the major stuff's there. I don't need this extra stuff for the first version. And I think it's time to go. I think it's time to push this thing. So that's how I decide when it's time. I go, all right, it's time to go. Let's do it. And then that's when I set a deadline. And from there, setting the deadline becomes, okay, there's still bugs to fix. There's still feedback and polishing to do. And I have to do this other marketing stuff, right? Updating the website. I'm going to make a video for this and a podcast probably. I have to reach out to people in the press that I would hope and like for them to cover this, which also means that I have to provide them with information and assets so that they can understand what this thing is and hopefully, tell a good story and stuff like that. So with all that stuff, I go, okay, I've done a lot of that stuff before. I know roughly the effort it takes to do it. And then I start looking at, a calendar to start kind of mapping this stuff out. So that's when I start to set a deadline with like pretty high confidence that I can hit it. And then as I get closer, and this is where like over the next, say, 2 weeks, the amount of bug fixes I can get done and the amount of like bug reporting that comes in from stuff is really going to matter and determine that launch date. But yeah, that's what's going on. So some of the things I do during launch mode, I've kind of talked about that. I just have a list here I'm looking at. But I think it's important, like things I don't do is nothing new, no new stuff. People ask for stuff all the time, right? Which is totally fine. I want new stuff too. But even if it seems there's definitely a danger here of like, oh, we can fit this in, right? Like someone asks for something so minor, so little that it's you're like, we can get this in, no big deal, let's go. But I really like, this is where like I'm like, no new stuff. It can come a couple weeks after the launch. That's totally fine, no big deal. I think again, like it can be stressful to think about this stuff because people's first impression of a new feature, you're nervous about that. Like I'm nervous about it. I want people to like it. But this is like, again, the beauty of software, which is if this was like, if I was making like a physical thing that I had to ship out, then like, yeah, like I would approach this differently. But since it's software and I can add new things in the future and I can change stuff, like the pressure is more self-imposed than anything. So I think this is where I get very disciplined about what's in and what's not. So now I'm in launch mode and it's going to be all bug fixes and polishing going forward. And this is an exciting period because I actually feel like today I feel pretty relaxed because like the past 2 weeks, the amount of just like heads down work on CarPlay, widget shortcuts, performance stuff has been significant. And today is like the first day in like 2 weeks where I'm like, ooh, okay. I'm like feeling a little relaxed, but also ready to kind of like dive back in and, fix all the known bugs and get things working really well so that I can share this thing. Because launching is fun. Oh my goodness. So much fun. Love it. So that's launch mode, gang. So I'm going to be busy the next couple weeks getting this thing moving. And I will try and share, we'll see how it goes. Like I'm going to try and share my progress through that stuff because I think it is interesting to know, like, what am I doing during launch mode? Like, updating the website and writing support docs and reaching out to the press and all that stuff. Like, I think these are very, when you're kind of like an indie developer and you're so focused on like the thing you're building, but like sharing that thing out with people and telling people about it. I mean, it matters. It really matters. So, getting that stuff working, I think is interesting. So anyway, but that's it for launch mode. I'm ready to go. And I think that's it for this episode of Worklog too. So first off, thank you for watching or listening, whatever you're doing. I appreciate it. And if you have any feedback for me, just leave a comment. If you like this format, if you hate this format, whatever, any feedback you share, I find is very helpful. So what you should do is subscribe to the YouTube channel, subscribe to the podcast, check out Sofa if you've never seen it or used it or anything. I'll have links for all that stuff in either the show notes or description, so you can very easily check it out. But anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.